Thank you for having me, folks. It's delightful to be here. It's delightful to give an extended commercial for our concert next Sunday afternoon. Um, so, what I put together for you is kind of a little bit of an informal history of how the concert has come together. And along the way, I'll tell you a little bit about what we know about Dyletsky's life and output, which is not much. We don't know much. He's kind of a mystery, which makes it interesting. And I'll give you a little bit of a taste of the music, and I'll talk a little bit about how we created the performing editions that we are performing from, and then we can have a little bit of Q&A. So, Unto Ages of Ages is the direct translation of the end of the doxology. We in the Anglican tradition say world without end, which has become forever and ever. But it's this idea of an age is a sort of unimaginably long period of time. And if you have an age of ages, then you have an unimaginably long collection of unimaginably long periods of time. And you have multiple of those collections, then you have an unimaginably large number of unimaginably large collections of unimaginably long periods of time. And so I just love the way the phrase "unto ages of ages" captures the sort of infinity of infinities that is really meant by that phrase at the end of the doxology. And that's what the English translation used within the Eastern Christian tradition. That's how it's spoken at the end of each doxology. So we decided to entitle our concert "Unto Ages of Ages." So this began with a random YouTube discovery. I was bored and surfing YouTube, and I happened to come across one of those scrolling score videos where somebody has taken a recording of a piece of music and then taken the time to create images of every single page of the score of said recording, and then sequence the pages so that they scroll by in the YouTube video as you are listening to the piece. And this was the first one that I came across. So let's see if it will behave. And here it is. And here we go. So, as you can hear, it's spectacularly beautiful stuff. And I was watching the score scroll by and noticing the antiphonal texture within the composition, noticing that it was in Cyrillic, noticing that it was incredibly difficult to read, noticing that the resolution of the images was quite poor, and thinking to myself, okay, this must exist somewhere in the world as a printed score. Might I be able to get my hands upon it and then do this music with SDSC, which of course was my first thought. More on that challenge in just a moment. But meanwhile, um, I went on a little bit of a rabbit hole, as we do, and discovered two other YouTube playlists that have his stuff. And of course, this was the Easter canon, which at that moment meant nothing to me. I had no idea. I was familiar with the use of the word canon when we speak of the Eucharistic canon, for example, and so it's a sort of a sequence of stuff that happens in the middle of a church service. But I didn't know what it meant necessarily in this context. And then meanwhile, I came across two different other playlists of the Divine Liturgy. The Divine Liturgy is the Eastern Christian counterpart to our Eucharist. A lot of the stuff in the Divine Liturgy happens basically in the same order. There's just like 9,000 times more words. And if you think that Rite 1 is fancy and or tedious compared to Rite 2, Rite 1 has nothing on the Eastern Christian liturgy. Anyway, so I discovered the Kievan liturgy, which sounds a little bit like this. I'm just going to play you a little bit of the first track. Here it is. So I'm going to pause it there and just point out a couple of things. In this one in particular, you can really hear the back and forth between choir one and choir two. It's not necessarily laid out visually in this particular score in a way to let you see that visually as easily as you might otherwise, because this score is laid out soprano one, soprano two, alto one, alto two. They could have chosen to lay the score out soprano one, alto one, tenor one, bass one, soprano two, alto two, tenor two, bass two, in which case it would have been much clearer visually the back and forth between the two choirs. But in any case, this is how they happened to lay it out. Um, and you can also hear that it's a pretty robust sound this particular choir is singing with. And if it sounds to you a little teeny bit reminiscent of whatever Russian Orthodox church music you might have heard earlier in your life, particularly the stuff by Rachmaninoff that Bruce Borton was so dedicated to during his career, you're not entirely wrong. All of this stuff arose out of the Eastern Christian liturgical music tradition, which involved harmony from a very early point in time. And this is just a much earlier stop on that whole journey that eventually led to Rachmaninoff and even beyond. So that is the Kievan liturgy, which is for 8 parts for antiphonal choir, just like the Easter canon was. And then the third thing that I came across was the 4 part liturgy, which was much simpler and interesting for how different it is. So, a couple of observations about that right off the bat. First of all, you may notice some late Renaissance kind of sounds in there. You might notice some early Baroque kinds of sounds in there. In particular, you might notice that it actually reminds you a little bit of English and Italian madrigals, the way the stuff kind of goes back and forth, but not quite as intricate, say, as the polyphony of Palestrina, but also not quite as intricate as the counterpoint of Bach or Handel in their high Baroque fugues. The other thing that you might notice in this simpler 4 part texture is that, again, there's this weird sort of reminiscence of things that sound Russian Orthodox that we might be familiar with from later in history. So, specifically, what those things are is a lot of cadences that end on minor triads. By this point in Western Europe, more cadences tended to involve Picardy thirds, where the third of the chord was major in the cadence, even if the whole section of music which preceded it was in a minor key. And in this stuff, as is the case in traditional Russian Orthodox and Slavic Orthodox, sort of larger than just Russia, Slavic Orthodox chant, there is a sort of avoidance of those Picardy thirds, and cadences tend to stay in minor. They even have minor 5 chords which precede the 1 chord at the end of the cadence. So That's one reason why this sounds a little bit reminiscent of later stuff that you might associate with Slavic Orthodox choral music. So back to our story. Um, so I noticed that there were these YouTube scores. So that means that the scores must exist on paper somewhere, and they would be great for STSC. And I had no idea how to find the scores. So I embarked upon a very long process of trying to get in touch with literally everybody under the sun. And I was talking with Capella Romana in Portland, Oregon, and I was talking with Claudia Jensen in Washington State, and I was trying to find contact information for the Kyiv Chamber Choir and their director, Mykola Dyletsky. More about him in just a moment. And basically, it kept coming up like, and I would like, nobody was responding to my emails. I actually even contacted the dude that put this playlist together, and he pointed me to a link that was this sort of ramshackle website that had a weird collection of PDFs, most of which weren't what I was looking for. And I was like, thanks. But I was like, okay, well, this is going to take a longer effort. See what I can do and see what I can leverage. So meanwhile, I started looking into the actual factual background about Dyletsky himself. We know precious little about him. We think he might have been born around 1630. We think he was probably born in Kyiv because a fellow theoretician, Ioanni Kikorenev, refers to him as a resident of the city of Kyiv. I actually found a reference in some Ukrainian material that had been translated into English on the internet that said that there was a census taken in Kyiv in which he was registered as a resident of the city. I wasn't able to trace down any citations or attribution for that fact on that website, so I offer it to you with the possibility that it may be true. In any case, here's where it gets interesting. Kyiv was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you have to remember that the map of Europe in the 1600s looked very, very different from how it looks today. And if I had thought about it earlier, I probably should have put a map of what Europe looked like in the 1600s in this slide, but I didn't. But in any case, Poland and Lithuania formed this joint thing where some of the people towards the north spoke Lithuanian, and there were some folks that spoke Latvian, and then there was a big chunk of that territory that spoke Polish, and the nobility were all marrying each other. And that territory actually happened to encompass a good chunk of what is now Ukraine. What that meant is that Ukraine had this influx of Roman Catholicism through Poland and Lithuania, which were both Roman Catholic nations and ethnicities at that time. As is demonstrated, among other things, by their use of the Latin alphabet for their languages, whereas Ukraine uses the Cyrillic alphabet. And that was where the Ukrainian Uniate Catholic Church, which preserves the Eastern Christian liturgy in Church Slavonic, in the Cyrillic alphabet, but traces its authority structure back to Rome instead of to the Patriarch of Moscow. And at that time, it wasn't just the Patriarch of Moscow. There were lots of different patriarchs that are sort of vying for grand patriarchness. So there was the Ukrainian Uniate Catholic Church, and then there was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and then there was Poland, which was Roman Catholic, Lithuania, which was Roman Catholic. All of this permitted influences from other Roman Catholic nations, particularly Italy, to come eastwards along with their musical traditions. That's important because, as you may have noticed from the first two playlists, Dyletsky's music sounds a lot like Monteverdi and Schütz, and in particular, it uses the antiphonal choirs that Monteverdi and Schütz would have used during their time, as Gabrieli as well, during their time at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. So that musical language of antiphonal choirs and busy stuff that goes back and forth between two groups of musicians, followed by this big, huge grand suspension cadence, and then more stuff that goes back and forth. That musical idiom was creeping eastwards through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and then spreading into Cyrillic reading, Slavonic speaking, Orthodox faithful lands. So we know that he studied in Vilnius. We believe that he studied in the Vilnius Jesuit Academy. And in 1675, he published a big work in most likely in Polish that we only know about the existence of it because it's referred to a lot, but we don't have that original version. This was a music theory treatise that he then made two new linguistic versions of, the first of which appeared in Smolensk in 1677 in early modern East Slavic. Now, you have to remember that we're used to thinking that, for example, the English language was pretty English after the Norman conquest. And so Chaucer is a pain in the neck to read, but we can make our way through it. Shakespeare is pretty decent, and then, it becomes easier. 1677 is later than Shakespeare for us English speakers, but at that time, Russian and Ukrainian were only beginning to diverge linguistically. And the sense of separate ethnic identities and separate national identities was also only beginning to diverge. And this sort of cultural soup that involved Roman Catholicism and influences from Western Europe via Poland and Lithuania was part of that divergence. And then there was the Russian Empire further east that sort of stood culturally and politically against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So later versions of this musical treatise, both shorter and longer, appeared all over Eastern Europe in various languages. There was one that appeared in Moscow in 1678 in Russian, as sort of recognizably like pre-Russian Russian, as opposed to pre-Ukrainian Ukrainian. And in total, there are about 24 manuscript sources of this music theory book. Later in his life, he was mentioned in the early 1690s as a well-known master in the Tsar's court, so we know he made his way to Moscow. We think that he was in charge of one or more of the big cathedral choirs in Moscow. He would have been in Moscow during the time of Fyodor III or Ivan V, and during the childhood of Peter the Great. Ivan V and Peter the Great actually were co-regents of the Russian Empire for a time while Peter was a kid. And then Ivan V was conveniently done away with, and Peter the Great assumed the throne. We don't know if he was actually still alive in the 1690s. We just know that he was famous. And that's pretty much it. So, this musical grammar, what's it about? There's a picture of it. So you can see that there's diagrams, and in this one in particular, that is an Orthodox cross made out of musical staves. And he loved making these little graphic plays and sort of visual jokes out of musical staves, also to illustrate points in the musical grammar. You can see that the text is in an early form of the Cyrillic alphabet that looks very much like what you might have seen on Slavic icons. You can see that there's a 4-part score, but you also notice that there is not text underneath each staff. The text is just underneath the whole thing. And the singers would have been expected to read the text at one glance and then fit the syllables to the notes because they basically knew how the syllables went and they could look at the notes and read the notes and fit the syllables. And sometimes they would put an entire phrase underneath the first couple of measures of a long strand of music. And then the singers were supposed to fit the syllables and figure out the repetitions of the text until the composer put a new snippet of text underneath their staff. So modern singers have it way easier these days. So anyway, that's what the book looks like. This is one of those 2 dozen or so versions of it. Um, this style of calligraphy for early modern Slavic would have been used regardless of the dialect being used by the alphabet, if that makes sense. So the Ukrainian version would, or the Ukrainian-ish version would have looked a little bit like this, and the Russian-ish version would have also looked like this. You would only have been able to tell by actually reading the text, not necessarily by the calligraphy. So here's just a little close example. This musical treatise was a music theory textbook, but it was also a guide to how to compose pieces of music. This particular page shows examples of how to move one to joy and how to move one to sadness and how to move one to mixed emotions. Those are the 3 staves. So this was back in the time when things were not quite settled into just major and minor, but rather all of the different church modes were still in use in Western Europe, and all of the different chant modes, which evolved out of Greek Orthodox chant and then were Slavic Orthodoxy, were employed in Eastern Europe. And those modes and different scales and different intervals and different melodic patterns were all thought to have direct power upon human emotions. So this is very much a sort of Renaissance humanist view of musical cosmology, if you will. And it's also edging into what some of you might remember from music history classes being the Baroque doctrine of the affections, where music actually creates specific emotions within the listeners, and it is the composer's job essentially to create a trajectory of emotions by means of the various compositional devices one after another throughout a piece of music. So one of the useful things about this treatise is that it contains examples from Dyletsky's own work, but it also contains examples from other composers, particularly Marcin Mielczewski and Jacek Różycki. Those were Polish early Baroque composers that have helped us date Dyletsky's lifetime, because obviously if he's including their works in his stuff, he had to have been familiar with them. And if we know more about them, including when they lived and when they wrote stuff, then we can figure out, okay, Dyletsky had to have written this no earlier than 16, something or other, because he had to have been able to include these Polish composers with whom he probably became familiar when he was in Vilnius, which is the capital of Lithuania, which was also a big city within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where he was studying and working before he moved to Smolensk and then to Moscow. So, and here's the sort of big famous thing. That is Dyletsky's diagram of the circle of fifths. Dyletsky described the circle of fifths, in other words, realizing that if you go around the fifths from C to F sharp and then from C to G flat, keep in mind that G flat and F sharp were not necessarily considered to be the same note. They remained different pitches in the minds of most musicians, including in Western Europe, all the way into the mid-1800s. We know that because we have fingering charts for wind instruments prior to the boom system that became very famous on the flute and saxophone and got adapted for other instruments. So prior to those systems where there were lots of keys, wind instruments used what's called forked fingerings, where you leave one hole open and then you put some fingers back down after the open hole. Any of you who've learned recorder, F natural is a forked fingering, right? There are fingering charts that give separate fingerings for example, A flat versus G sharp. And so we know that those pitches were understood to be distinct all the way up through the mid-1800s. However, it was also theorized that if you simply acknowledged that F sharp and G flat were close enough to occupy the same place on the ladder, or choose your metaphor, then you could make the whole system into a circle. And that idea of making the whole system into a circle by fifths and fifths and fifths and fifths was first described in the world by Dyletsky. The next person to do so independently was Johann Heinichen in Germany in 1711. Now, we think that Heinichen also came up with it on his own, but Dyletsky beat him to it. So, musical output. We have surviving copies in multiple manuscript sources of 3 settings of the Divine Liturgy. You saw 2 of them a little bit ago. You saw the 4-voice liturgy, you saw the 8-voice Kievan liturgy, and then there's another 8-voice one that he called the proportional liturgy that is entirely in what we would now think of as 3-1, or 3 whole notes per grouping. Modern editions of it usually transcribe it as 3-2, but the entire thing from the opening doxology to the final amen for the entire liturgy is in triple meter. It's beautiful, while, and then you're like, my kingdom for a 2-4. And he wrote that one in particular to sort of make a musicological / music theory point that you could, in fact, write an entire thing with all the cadences and all of the phrase structures in what was called proportio perfecta, in other words, perfect proportion, which, since 3 is the number of the Trinity, means that there have to be 3 beats per grouping. He also wrote a service of the Liturgy for the Dead in Slavonic. That has just been recently edited for performance and recorded by the Wrocław Baroque Ensemble, which I'm going to show you in just a second. He wrote a complete setting of the hymns from the Resurrection canon, and this is where I finally began to understand what was meant by Easter canon. So we are familiar on Easter Vigil with a sequence of 7 readings that have their responsories, and then there's usually a canticle afterwards, and then there's a prayer. Similarly, during the office of Matins, which is the sort of midnight office within Christendom, both Eastern and Western. Within the office of Matins in the Eastern tradition, there's a sequence of odes, which have responsories and prayers that occupy very much a similar function on the night that passes from Holy Saturday into Easter Sunday. If you ever get a chance to go to an Eastern Christian Easter liturgy, do so. It's amazing. That also happened to be the moment, and this I didn't realize this before this particular moment because I'm dumb, but I had always been puzzled by the fact that in Handel's Messiah, there's so much stuff about Christmas, and there's so much stuff about the passion and suffering of Christ, and then all of a sudden he's risen and we're talking about the aftermath. Until my very first time at an Eastern Christian Easter liturgy, you leave the church and you circle the church singing 3 times. Then the priest takes his staff and pounds on the door and says, "Lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be ye lift up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in." And someone inside the church says, "Who is this King of glory?" And it all made sense to me, and I felt stupid because I was in my 30s. But like, oh, so that's sort of the central moment, but it's preceded by these 8 readings and odes, and Dyletsky's Easter canon are settings of these 8 hymns that are used in that portion of the Easter liturgy that we think of as being the readings where everybody's holding the candles and trying not to drip wax on their knees. Dyletsky also wrote some settings of Vespers texts, although we don't have a complete Vespers service by him. We haven't found one. There may be one, but we haven't come across it yet. There's some musing that Dyletsky there might be a lot of stuff that is Dyletsky's that's not clearly identified as Dyletsky's lurking in various cathedral and monastery libraries throughout Eastern Europe, kind of waiting to be figured out, but we don't know yet. And then this last thing is what's interesting. So the idea of a sacred concerto is a good chunk of the latter half of the musical grammar. And sacred concertos were concert-ish type works in that they required professional level singers because they were beastly difficult, and they were very virtuosic and showy, but they had sacred texts, and they were in fact designed to be performed within the context of a liturgy, just like Monteverdi's Vespers has incredibly ridiculously difficult stuff that requires professionally trained musicians, but was still designed to be performed within the context of a Vesper service. These sacred concertos, of course, were entirely vocal because musical instruments are not allowed within sanctuaries of Orthodox spaces. So they had to be entirely vocal, which meant that a lot of the functions that we would think of as being served by basso continuo in Baroque music had to be taken over by the basses of the choirs. And when you come to the concert, which I hope all of you will, you'll hear that there are not only full SATB or even SATB sections of the music, but there are also a lot of these little duets that basically correspond to duets over the top of basso continuo, except the basso continuo is being sung by the basses of the choir. So these sacred concertos were written to lots and lots of different sacred texts and were able to be inserted in multiple points in liturgies wherever the music director decided, just like late 1500s and early 1600s motets were often inserted at various points in the liturgies. And those motets in Western Europe served lots of different functions. Like you could take an Easter motet and you could do it anytime in Easter season, even if the text didn't match up with one of the propers. Similarly, Dyletsky's sacred concertos could be inserted throughout a season rather than only being proper to one specific day. So we're doing a couple of those sacred concertos. Okay, so as I said, his music is kind of like Monteverdi, Gabrieli, and Schütz. There are no instruments. We've mentioned the fact that you have homophonic textures like that four-voice thing that you heard third in my little YouTube examples. Polyphonic stuff where you've got different contrapuntal lines happening at the same time, and also polychoral stuff where you've got one choir over here and one choir over here, kind of duking it out musically between each other. There is a lot of overt word painting. One of my favorites is the word skakashe. Skakashe means leaping or jumping around or frolicking, and the choir gets to sing this motive, skakashe. And so, and that like that figure, skaka, goes back and forth between the parts of the choir when we're talking about King David leaping and frolicking in the fields of the Lord. So there's lots of that kind of stuff. It's really, really fun. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's the influence of earlier Slavic Orthodox harmonic writing with cadences on minor chords. But there's also lots of places where Dyletsky completely breaks the rules that we all learned in music theory class. There's parallel fifths all over the place. There's parallel octaves all over the place. There are all of these crunchy clashes where there will be, say, a G major chord that's supposed to be functioning as a 5 chord, but somebody's singing a C natural already, or a C natural that's left over from something that came before, and they don't bend. It just stays there. And so you get all these really neat crunches. There's even one cross relation where you will hear the alto singing an F sharp against the soprano's F natural at the same time, which is super cool. So some of those cross relations were common if you've ever listened to Tallis, for example. Tallis has some of those crunchy moments. Bird a little bit. The Italians and the Flemish, not so much. They were much more like careful to kind of clean up their their voice leading. But Dyletsky has no compunction whatsoever about letting there be clashes all over the place. And it ends up being a really cool kind of like tension building sort of texture. And then when it finally resolves on a triad, it's all the more because you've had not only the harmonic tension of a 5 chord with an added seventh or whatever, but then there's these notes that don't belong whatsoever and they won't go away. And then finally they resolve. So, all right. I'm going to play some stuff for you in a little bit, but I just want to give you a little bit more background about our process. So as I mentioned, I was looking for performing editions, and I kept coming up with basically there were like a handful of pieces in CPDL, the Choral Public Domain Library. There was a fair amount of stuff in Cyrillic that I knew I was going to have to retranscribe into the Latin alphabet if I wanted to be able to use it. I realized that while the singers of STSC are brilliant, asking them to learn the entire Cyrillic alphabet and read an entire concert from Cyrillic printing might result in a rebellion. So, so one of the first things that I came across was this document that was done by the Polish musicologist Irina Gerasimova in conjunction with the University of Warsaw. Hopefully it will, yeah, fine. Here we go. This is a 259-page thing that the University of Warsaw just made available for free on the internet. So, and in it, Irina Gerasimova goes through and collects every single known manuscript version of all of Dyletsky's 4-part stuff, compares them all to one another. I'm just going to scroll through the critical apparatus and show you how much stuff. Look at this list. Every one of those little things that you see scrolling by is a variant between 2 different manuscript versions of the same piece. It goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on, and then we finally get to her editions of the music. But it's like 100 pages of this document is just the critical apparatus comparing variants of the manuscripts. But the gold mine comes a little bit later. Boom. So she has it in Cyrillic and she has it in Latin alphabet. I was like, okay, great. Well, it's only the 4-part stuff. I really wanted to do the 8-part stuff because the 4-part stuff is beautiful, but the 8-part stuff is amazing. So, of course, I hunted everywhere. She hasn't edited the 8-part stuff yet. Apparently, she's in the process of editing some of the 8-part stuff. And even a little bit of it, she has been able to circulate to the Wrocław Baroque Ensemble, but it's not available in the wild yet. And I was like, I'll pay for this stuff. Just tell me how to get it. Nobody responded to my emails. All right, fine. So I did use these as the basis of the 4-part pieces that we're doing, but it was a little bit of a dead end. I have also used some of this edition at Binghamton. It's been great for the choirs there, but there's not a whole lot of pieces that are appropriate for the rep. But anyway, it was a neat find. It was super fun reading about him through the material, but it didn't give me the editions of the music that I was really after. So going back to that, so what we did was we decided to just do it the old-fashioned way. These editions are now available all over the internet in really, really ratty PDFs, if you can find them, but they don't exist for all of the 8-part stuff. The dude that made the playlist found them. These are Russian editions by Nina Gerasimova Persidskaya. They were made in the late 70s and early 80s. We tracked down some of the PDFs, but we couldn't find all of them. So what we did was we stopped the YouTube video at each page, took a screenshot, compiled the screenshots into a folder, and sent the folder of screenshots to an engraver whom we paid to transcribe them for me into music XML files that I could then edit. So here is the beginning of the Easter canon, the Voskresenia Den, that was the very first piece of music that you heard. That's what it looks like on YouTube. And that's what it looks like in the engraving. So he spent a whole lot of time, and we paid him a good chunk of change, um, to transcribe it exactly as it was, but with no text, so that I could then go enter text. While we were working on that, Mykola Dyletsky, the director of the Kyiv Chamber Choir, finally got back to me and sent me this. Yes, 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 go away. So there's the resurrection canon in 4 staves rather than 8, with choir 1 here, choir 2 here, but as you can see, it's still in Cyrillic. And transcribing things reduced down to 4 staves rather than 8 would have actually been twice as time consuming, because you have to make all the stems go the right direction. You have to organize all of the things where the rhythms don't line up. And by this point, since I already had the grainy YouTube images and Sam Cornwall was already working on them, I was like, okay, this way I can factor in and use this edition as basically my referee when I've got questions about things. And also, he indicates a little bit more in the way of performance information. So you can see dynamics, you can see crescendos and diminuendos and retardandos. These were the additions that he made for the Kyiv Chamber Choir, whom you heard earlier in this talk, to actually sing from. So he sent me those. I sent him back a lengthy thank you email. And basically, what I've done is taken the stuff that Sam transcribed, taken this stuff, and use it to sort of get clearer readings on the text. And then I entered it into our editions. So before I could do that, I had to decide on a transcription system. I actually put this question to the singers themselves. Irina Gerasimova's system kind of is what you're used to seeing when you see Ukrainian or Russian transcribed. The materials that I got from the Metropolitan Cantor Institute for the Byzantine Catholic Church in Pittsburgh use an orthography that's a little bit cleaner, and it's based on Czech/Slovak. A lot of Slovak Eastern Rite Christians use this kind of transcription for Church Slavonic when they sing Church Slavonic in the liturgy. And then the third option was, of course, the International Phonetic Alphabet, which some of our singers are really, really facile with, and some of our singers are like, please don't put that in front of my eyeballs. And I let them vote. And they voted on the middle one, the one that's sort of based on Czech. Some of them were familiar with Czech, but I think most of them preferred it just because it's cleaner and less ambiguous. So that's what we settled on. And oh, this is really tiny. I'm not sure if I can make this bigger for you, but I can pull it up elsewhere. Let me see if I can pull it up fast for you. Here's This is a race. How fast can Bill find things within his own Google Drive? Boom. There you go. That's what we're singing from. So you can see Latin alphabet-based transcription, clean, mostly based on Czech orthography, but it represents all of the sounds in Church Slavonic. And zooming back out, because our engraver was able to work quickest if he simply kept everything in the same layout as those grainy YouTube images. We have soprano 1, soprano 2, alto 1, alto 2, etc. And then I can just show you a little bit of where it gets to. There's choir 1 singing. I'll make it a little bit smaller for you. And then choir 2 has quarter notes, while choir 1 has eighth notes, but you hear it kind of as 2 separate rhythms and 2 separate textures. So That's how it kind of evolved. Um, so now, what does the stuff sound like? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you three different performances of that same Voskresenia Den that you heard at the very beginning of the talk. Here, just to remind your ears of how it goes, is the Kyiv Chamber Choir. So that's the Kyiv Chamber Choir. Those recordings were made in the early 2000s. Here is the Partes Ensemble from Ukraine, directed by Natalia Khmilevska. She is part of this project called Open Opera Ukraine. And this has been, I mean, these recordings were made in 2023. This recording is kind of a really great example of why we're doing this concert and why we're organizing it as a benefit. The Ukrainian people refuse to let the war get in the way of art. This is 2023. Things are already a mess. And they make a recording that sounds like this. So you'll notice that it's a lot lighter sound than the Kiev Chamber Choir. This is a group that, I mean, they are all, this particular choir, the Partes Ensemble, is specifically dedicated to bringing Ukrainian Baroque music, including opera, to the wider public. And so these are singers that have studied Baroque performance practice across Europe, reconvened within Ukraine, and started doing these projects. You'll also notice there was lower pitch because it was at Baroque pitch. The third recording I'm going to play for you is the Wrocław Baroque Ensemble from Poland, directed by Andrzej Kosendiak. This is the ensemble that actually worked with Irina Gerasimova, the musicologist who put together that massive tome of the four-part stuff. She also edited the Requiem liturgy for the Wrocław Baroque Ensemble's album, but she hasn't made it public, which makes me go grrr. So I'm hoping that as soon as I can convince her to send it to me, we can get it, and then we can program a second concert of Dyletsky stuff with that Requiem liturgy at some point in the future. But anyway, here is their rendition of the Easter canon, which you've already heard two renditions of. Notice the difference in sound here. So again, an even lighter sound, that's only 8 singers. So it's one on a part. And they are leaning heavily into the Baroque side of things by doing a soft repeat of a louder first thing, like with the Prosvitim Sialudie. And they're also using a lot more Baroque articulation with things being sort of bouncier and more detached. Whereas both of the first two choirs were leaning more into the Renaissance sound of doing long legato lines that sort of rise and fall and ebb and flow. So that gives you a little bit of a taste. All three of these are available on all of the major streaming services. If there's a way for me to sort of like send links out in an email through, I'm happy to kind of put together a playlist.
We'll be posting the video online too. People can get it.
People can get it off there. Cool, awesome. So then, whoops. First half of the concert begins with the prayer Tsaryu Nebesny, which is a beautiful kind of intimate four-part prayer that often precedes the divine liturgy. Then we kind of take the 4-part liturgy and the 8-part Kievan liturgy and mix and match them so that you can hear a little bit of the variety of Dyletsky's writing styles. You're going to hear echoes of late Italian Renaissance polyphony, but you'll also hear the more expansive emotional range of early Baroque stuff and the antiphonal writing inspired by St. Mark's. In the second half, we open with the Resurrection canon. They're all very joyous, but some of them are sort of big, loud, fast, bouncy joyous, and some of them are kind of chill joyous. They are very, very pictorial, and we will be providing triple column texts with Cyrillic and Slavonic in Latin alphabet and English translations for you to follow along with, so you can see what we are singing as we sing it. But each of the 8 hymns is furnished with a very, very specific musical treatment, and they're very different from one another. So it's really, really fun sort of getting to sing through a huge variety of musical treatments of these texts. And then we close with the Sacred Concerto. Remember how I was talking about those? Pridite Ljudje, which is Come, O ye people. And it's a huge, long text in praise of the Holy Trinity. How many of y'all have read the Athanasian Creed? Go read the Athanasian Creed. It's in the back of the prayer book. You will never again think that the Nicene Creed is too long. But one of the things about the Athanasian Creed is that once you kind of get into reading it, it has this sort of rolling, building rhythm of phrases and ideas that's actually really quite beautiful and quite poetic. It's a little bit daunting when you first start reading it, and then by the time you're in the middle of it, it's very captivating. This piece is sort of the same way. When we first read through it with STSC, they're like, oh my God, it's so long. But then we had a rehearsal last weekend where we sort of finally got some momentum with it, and it's actually incredibly powerful. It alternates between full choir stuff and often trio stuff, alto, tenor, bass, or else trio stuff, alto, alto bass, or tenor, tenor bass. And so it's this alternation between smaller groupings and the full choir grouping that allow it to kind of have this rise and fall that builds and builds and builds and builds until this final huge acclamation in praise of the Trinity at the very end. So it's a wonderful sort of summation of all of this, of the ways that Dyletsky can manipulate music in the service of both art and praise. I should say that the concert is sponsored by the Broome County Arts Council and the Community Foundation for Central New York, particularly because their sponsorship has allowed all of the donations that we collect at the door to go to Regenerate Ukraine. Regenerate Ukraine is an organization that works within Ukraine and within Ukrainian diaspora and amongst Ukrainian refugees to basically help the Ukrainian population of the world withstand and recover from the war in about every imaginable way. And we're really, really glad that we are able to do this. We're very, very thankful to the Broome County Arts Council and the Community Foundation for providing us with enough funds to completely cover the expenses of the concert. And that way, every dollar that's given at the concert itself goes to this and not to us. So please come. Please consider being generous because this is where your money will go. And the details are next Sunday, November 9th, 3 p.m., St. Michael's Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Church. By the way, the word Russian has nothing to do with Russia. It's an early 20th century kind of weird misspelling of the word Rusin, which is another word for the Ruthenians that live in eastern Slovakia and western Ukraine. And that's the cultural heritage of St. Michael's. It's at 296 Clinton. It's spectacularly beautiful and the acoustics are wonderful. It is free and open to the public, so you can tell all of your family to come and any students that you have in contact with, tell them to come also. And the voluntary donations will go to Regenerate Ukraine. And thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Questions? Yes.
First question is, does any of this cross-reference to what early Christianity was from like the 14th and 15th century? Or was this like the Orthodox was totally separate and on its own?
Well, so the Orthodox will tell you that we Westerners are the ones who broke away. But the liturgies that are used in Eastern Christianity mostly date from the early single digit centuries, so like the 300s, the 400s. By the time we get to the 13 and 1400s, Western Europe's had a pretty distinct liturgical tradition. Remember, the Great Schism between East and West happened in 1054. So that was when the Archbishop of the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope excommunicated each other. Things have been patched up a little bit since then, but you know. But anyway, so those liturgies got considerably simplified in the Western Church over centuries after centuries after centuries after centuries. But in Eastern Christianity, including amongst the Uniate churches who have their authority structure go to Rome, but have their liturgies still be the liturgies of Orthodoxy, those liturgies are pretty much word for word what was originally used in Greek and Syriac in the 200s, 300s, 400s. So
The second question is, which one of these early centuries were you born? Because you know,
what you have heard this afternoon is the tiniest fraction of what there is to share about this stuff. I mean, you know, I'm a cradle Episcopalian myself. I grew up in Eastern Shore Chapel in Virginia Beach, but I've always kind of been a little bit of a liturgical nerd. And so when I mean, this whole project for me personally has been rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and I have neglected my husband and my cats and certainly plenty of stuff happening at Binghamton University because this stuff is so fascinating. So, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Did you get any, when you have rehearsed at St. Michael's, have any people from St. Michael's listened to you?
Well, I mean, Father Jim Dutko, who's the rector, yeah, he often will open the church and close it up for us, and he loves to sit and listen. There have been a couple of other folks who have helped open or close the sanctuary for us that have sat and listened. I think I have seen more than one person sitting next to each other, but I think the bootleg rehearsal videos that Father Jim has been taking and has been circulating amongst the parishioners are how most of them are getting exposed to it so far. There have not been a lot of people sneaking into rehearsals yet.
My question is because Bruce did the Rachmaninoff thing and people from St. Michael's came and sang
Sure.
and disagreed with what you were doing in terms of pronunciation.
Well, I mean, there's a good reason for that, because the Russian style pronunciation of Church Slavonic is vastly different from the Southeastern European style of pronunciation. And so doing Rachmaninoff in a way that Russian listeners will recognize means doing Rachmaninoff in a way that Ukrainian and Ruthenian faithful will think is completely wrong. It's actually very similar to, if any of y'all are familiar with the difference between Italian Latin and German Latin, it's a very similar situation to
Church
that.
Latin and academic
Yeah,
Latin.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Make a comment.
Please.
I remember us doing those pieces and Bruce had, I believe it was Nancy Titler from the Russian department.
Yeah.
She was in charge of pronouncing all the words.
Sure.
So we practiced all that. Then the people from the churches, they had sort of a different style of pronouncing.
Yes.
The words.
Exactly.
So,
and I mean, if
always kind of
sure
arguing, how do you do this?
Right. Yeah. And if you put folks from the Russian Orthodox Church and folks from the Ukrainian or the Ruthenian Orthodox Church into the same room at the same time and ask them to speak the same words, they will pronounce it at the same time completely differently from one another. Other questions?
So they do have pews where we can sit.
Yes.
We don't have men on one side standing and women on the other side.
No.
So Bill, thank you very much. This is terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.